for that kind of interaction. For us, it's definitely a pleasure being here in Troopers. We really loved this conference. So yeah, as Anna was saying, I'm Mariano Nunes, the CEO of Anapsys. Yes.
What Anapsys?
And yeah, so as Anna was saying, we started researching on SAP back in 2006, basically around some new attack vectors that we research on. And since then, we have been doing more presentations on that topics and how attackers may break into SAP systems. And over the last year or so, we started looking really at, okay, what's the next step, right? There is definitely a problem here. We have highlighted ways into how people can break into the systems. We have highlighted ways into how companies can protect themselves from these attacks. But how we can help companies really detect or analyze if they have been actually hacked, if they're being attacked right now. Thanks a lot. So that's what we're going to be covering today in this talk. So quick introduction to Anapsys. We are solely focused on the security of ERP systems, mostly around SAP solutions, but we're also starting to cover Oracle ERP platforms. JP and one of our researchers, Jordan, did already a talk on attacks to Civil and JD Edwards, that are both from Oracle as well, with some very interesting findings in the OWASP AppSec Talk conference last year. So we're headquartered in Boston. We have research and development mostly in Buenos Aires in Argentina, and now we're also looking for great people here in Germany, so come speak with us if you are interested in that later on. We basically provide security software solutions based on ERP systems. We have SAP certified software. We have provide services and trainings. Yeah, that's some more background information about us. What I just wanted to highlight also is that two other guys from our research labs, Ezequiel and Nahuel, really work a lot are working a lot on this topic, so we want also to thank them for their research. So we're going to be, this is what we're going to be looking at today. A very quick introduction to SAP. I don't know how many of you have SAP in your company. I guess you guys really have, right? Okay, yeah, most of you. So for the ones that do not have, or maybe they do have SAP, but you may have SAP, but you are not familiar with SAP, we're going to make a quick introduction. Then we're going to talk about forensics. We're going to do like a story of an attacker, trying to break into a SAP system, and a detective trying to see which kind of fingertips he may be leaving in the system, and then we're going to draw some conclusions on that. So quick intro to SAP. SAP is basically the largest provider of business solutions in the world. Right? So over 140,000 implementations, over 90,000 customers around the globe. So this basically means that most of our business critical processes, large commercial organizations, government, or defense, they're run by SAP systems. So you may have heard some SAP like solutions or words like business intelligence, ERP, CRM, portal, PI, GRC. So all these kind of difficult names to remember are different SAP solutions with different, some of them have different security architectures, different, obviously, business purposes. But what we're going to be talking about today is pretty much going across many of them, because we're talking about threats affecting, or ways to detect threats affecting the SAP NetWeaver layer. It's like a common base framework for many of these solutions. So again, in plain English, what is SAP is basically what's safeguarding the business crown jewels in the company, right? So processes like invoicing, procurement, human resources data, financial plan and treasury. So all the critical information is in the SAP system. So why would an attacker actually go after an SAP system? I think that you already saw that in the previous slide. All the critical business data is there. So what he would be looking at after, what he's looking for if he's trying to attack our SAP system. He may be trying to engage in espionage attacks. That's just stealing sensitive information. You may have like manufacturing data, personal data, financial statement. He may be going after that. He may be just trying to take the systems offline, right? You can think or imagine, picture yourself in your company all just from an employee perspective, many of our employees are working all day with the SAP system. So if someone is taking the SAP systems offline continuously, that would make us send people, thousands of people home, right? So that's already a huge cost. But also, he can be disrupting interfaces with payment gateways and things like that. And finally, fraud, right? He may be trying to engage in a financial fraud, modifying financial statement, creating ghost vendors, and things like that. So basically, what we started talking in 2007 was that we started seeing SAP security as a different concept, or let's say a more complete concept. Usually, SAP security was all about segregation of duties controls, this meaning user authorizations, right? So what the users that I have on my system, what kind of activities they can do. And we try to make sure that only the minimum or the less privileged, or less amount of authorizations they have so that they cannot do any dangerous business process. But if we analyze an SAP system, maybe you can put in a layered approach, we see that obviously they have an operating system, a database, and then we have on top of that the SAP solution. So segregation of duties controls are basically applying at what we call the SAP business logic layer. So all these kind of business controls. However, there is a layer below, like kind of a gray area, that's called what we call the SAP application layer. That's usually a NetWeaver or basis layer, where we find that it's the weak spot today for most SAP systems. Anyway, what I just wanted to highlight here, we wanted to highlight here is that even if we're talking about forensics or attacks or threats, we should not forget about the database and operating system layers, right? Because a compromise to any of these layers would result in a complete compromise of all the SAP system, the entire SAP system. So what we found so far while doing SAP penetration tests or assessments to our customers is that over 95% of times that we did a penetration test, we were able to successfully compromise the systems, right? Exploiting vulnerabilities in the SAP application layer. So the worst problem, I think, or the worst thing that we have here is that different to segregation of duty gaps, an attacker doesn't need a user account in the system to exploit most of these vulnerabilities. So we're talking about someone who just knows the IP address of our SAP system, and using an exploit or exploiting one of these issues, he can get full control of our entire business information and processes. Right? So that's what we're kind of trying to detect and fight against. So let's get in the forensics part. So there's a Wikipedia definition on forensics if someone has not heard about the term before. But basically, in English, we're trying to find the answer for that questions. Has my SAP platform been hacked? Right? Have I already have a security breach in the past? And also, I am being attacked right now. Right? Can I see how can I try to understand if I'm being attacked right now? So we will see, obviously, we'll talk only about free solutions and free ways into how you can detect these kind of activities, mostly by the capabilities provided by SAP itself in order to help you detect these kind of traces, or enable these kind of traces. So this is something that we also find very often. This would be, the left would be like an IT security guy, an information security manager in a company. The right one would be like the SAP guy over there, maybe. So maybe when we talk with an SAP company or user, obviously most of the people say that their SAP system has never been hacked, right? So the follow-up questions that we do is like, okay, so do you have logs enabled, right? Do you have the security audit log? Do you have the change log, documents log? And the typical answer that we get is that, no, what are you talking about? So what we see a lot is that we really don't know, right? So we don't know if we have we have suffered a security breach or not, because we are not really tracing for that information. Also, we get the question about, are really attacks against SAP systems going on, right? So I don't know how many of you have heard about this news. Anyone before? So basically in October last year, Anonymous claimed to have broken into the Greek Ministry of Finance, which is yet to be confirmed. But the most important or interesting thing for us doing SAP research is that it was the first time that we saw in the headlines someone publicly saying that they were doing that, or they have an SAP exploit, a 0-day, and they were, as you see there, they were kind of planning to use it widely, right? So just what I want to highlight there is that, what I want to highlight here is that by being in contact with customers and by doing the trainings that we do, we often get confident. In confidence, people tell us, hey, you know what? We have suffered a security breach in our SAP system. We had this problem. But obviously, that doesn't get to the news, right? So I think this could be something interesting as a game changer to really have more people realize that this is something that's totally possible if we are not protecting the systems completely, holistically. So basically what we are going to be looking at today, analyzing today, just as we finish this introduction, is how can we trace this? Which features, which capabilities SAP provide us to trace these attacks? And we're going to do that analyzing the course of action of a sample SAP attack, or a set of SAP attacks. So basically, if we divide an attack on two big phases, we have the first one being an anonymous attacker that doesn't have any user and password breaking into the system, and or a valid user elevating privileges to get access to sensitive functionality. And once he gets that access, then the attacker will try to perform fraudulent business processes or access sensitive business information. So most of the segregation of duties controls usually try to prevent this. What we have been talking over these years is how we can prevent this, and what we're going to see today is mostly on how to detect that very first phase of the attack, right? So for that, we basically have two guys invited to our session. First one is the attacker, that some of you may know this guy. So if you don't, this guy has basically done a big fraud some years ago and he's facing he's going to spend only 150 years in prison because of that. So this would be our attacker, right? He's trying to do a fraud on an SAP system, and then we chose a very smart detective to help us with this. So you may recognize him. He's going to be also in some of the slides. And here we have also something that some of you may be looking for. So I give you just a few seconds to take a picture or something if you're participating in some kind of challenge for a conference. Right? Dan, ready? Okay. So now JP will walk us through the attacker, how the attacker is going after the system, and how our detective friend will be trying to really see what he's doing and try to see how that affects the SAP system.
Okay, thanks, Mariano. So we are following the attacker's trace. So we are trying to act as an attacker right now and see which kind of traces are being generated. So we have an SAP system. This is the IP address. And we want to try to see what's being exposed in this IP address. Basically, this is the attacker who is trying to break into the system, right? So if we run an nmap, we will see that there are some services discovered, exposed. So this could be, for example, the 8080. This is a web dispatcher or an ACM. This is a web interface. But we can do a full port scanning, and we will see that there is another port which is open as well. This is the SAP router port 329. It's not.
So basically, this is. Put yourself for a second in the shoes of the attacker, right? And he's trying to break into a company running SAP. So he knows the IP ranges of that company exposed to internet or maybe internally, whatever. And he's just doing an nmap to see what services is it provided. The first phase of of an attack, right? So what he has discovered is 2 ports right now. 8080 with a web dispatcher, we'll see what may be behind that, and a 3299 that's a SAP router, or says that it's a SAP router. We'll see that.
So this could be a typical implementation exposing some services to an untrusted network. So, well, it's running, but the results of the scanning is that there are only 2 services. One of them is the SAP router, and the other is the web dispatcher. So we know the 2 entry points, right? What we can do right now is we can try to analyze the security of the services that are behind this IP address. Okay. So we can use the Bizploit to analyze the ports. Yeah, we can analyze the SAP router and also the web dispatcher. So if we connect to this port, we will see that there is a web dispatcher interface. This is the web interface of the SAP systems. And if we access the SAP admin, we will see that there is a prompt, credentials being prompted to us. So an attacker would definitely try something like this.
So just to give you a head up on the web dispatcher, we can see in the slides what the web dispatcher is, right? So basically, it's one of the services that expose, if you're running an SAP web application, you probably have a web dispatcher today, right? In the next slide, we see that the web dispatcher is basically sitting on the DM seed, the public DM seed, and working as a reverse proxy for all our SAP web applications. So what JB is showing now is that the attacker has discovered this port, looks, oh, it's a web interface, oh, it's probably a web dispatcher, so he tries and see if he can break into through the administration interface.
So as this is the initial point of contact with the attacker to the SAP system, there are some traces that could also be retrieved from this initial contact. Okay. We have 2 features in the web dispatcher which are useful regarding getting traces and doing forensics. One of them is the security log, and we can basically get events or information regarding HTTP fuzzing attempts if the attacker configures some strange characters and sends requests, you will see there. And also incorrect login attempts are also logged there, so it's useful information regarding security. Which kind of information do we have in the log files? We have date and time, of course, the IP address, which could be an IP address from the internet or any untrusted network, and then the contents of the request performed by the attacker. That's the security log. And this is, we have this format for all the different features that we will see. For each one of the features of logging and tracing and auditing, you will have a summary of the different limitations and features provided by this tracing facility.
Yeah, it is that I mean, we're not going to go into the detail of every feature because it's going to be quite a boring presentation otherwise, but it's for you to take away, right, and see, really have as a reference to go to and see what this kind of logging or trace would be providing me. So the important thing about the security log is that in the ICM, that's also like the SAP web application server, in the web dispatcher that we are looking at right now is not enabled by default. In the ICM, it is. It's one of the few like tracing systems or mechanisms that is enabled by default.
And then you have the HTTP log, which actually register all the requests to the server. So you have also HTTP fuzzing requests, but you also have requests to different applications. So you can trace whether an attacker is trying to break into a dangerous application or a critical application for us. And then you have a little bit more information. Of course, the date and time, the IP address, requests, parameters, and
So many times we don't know, even though, I mean, we ask a question, so, okay, what web applications are we exposing, what SAP web applications we're exposing, what SAP web applications people are using to get into the system. This could be also a way to analyze that. But definitely keep a track of what people is really using through the web interface.
Yeah, and in the summary, something to point out is that it is not enabled by default, so you have to enable this on purpose.
It's very similar to the like an Apache log file, so an access log file. That's pretty much what you'll see there with the default configuration.
Okay, and the second service that the attacker discovered is a SAP router. According to the port, we can definitely think that this is a SAP router. We will analyze it later with the Bizploit, which is an open source tool that we have in our web page. So basically, the SAP router is a way to restrict access to SAP systems through SAP protocols. Okay, so typically it's between an untrusted network and a trusted network, and you can restrict which IP addresses can access which SAP system in the backend.
So in your companies, you highly likely have a SAP router because it's used by SAP itself to provide you with support services, right, and monitoring services. So even though you think you may not be using this, it's probably, I mean, should not be exposed to the internet, should be connected through a VPN with SAP, but we find it many times exposed directly to the internet because obviously it's easier.
And the security of the SAP router is driven by an ACL, which you need to configure, allowing which IP address can access which service and IP address in the backend. And if it's not properly configured, there are several attacks that can be performed. So we have been researching on this. We have published SAP Security in Depth, which is a white paper that you can download from our webpage, and some other blog posts regarding SAP router security. But basically what you can do is you can perform port scanning in the backend systems, trying to access systems in the backend which are not directly exposed to the untrusted network. So let's see what an attacker would be able to do.
So the attacker tried to access the web interface, admin, he was not lucky, he was lazy enough to switch to the next port to see if it was easier, and so he now is trying to see what he may find with the SAP router.
So we're going to use Bizploit, and this is, we are using some scripts which are basically configuring where is the SAP router, which is the port, and the plugin that is trying to perform a scanning through the SAP router. So as you can see here, we are configuring IP range, the scanning mode.
So basically, I mean, we are, as an attacker, we are scanning the 0.194 IP address, and with the SAP router spy plugin, what we say is, okay, I want to analyze or to do a port scan of these targets. But you have to bear in mind for this demo is that the SAP system is running on the same IP, but here you will have the internal IP address range of the company. What the attacker guesses, it's the internal IP address range. So this could be a 0.0/24 or something like that, and we'll do a full scan of that network range. In this case, it's exactly the same one, but won't be.
So when the attacker tried to reach the 0.194 IP address, he wasn't able to access all the services. But going through the SAP router, he actually is, because the ACL is not properly configured. So you can see that all these services, many of these are SAP-related services. So if the attacker tries to go directly to production, to the system with the SAP GUI, he's not going to be able to do that. You can see here that the error message, if he points directly to a system, he's not going to be able to access. But if he configures the SAP router, the results are going to be different. Okay. So he's going through the SAP router, and as this is another point of contact between the attacker and the SAP system, there are also traces that could be retrieved and used in order to identify the attacker.
So in that phase already, what we've seen is that the attacker saw the subrouter, he did the port scan, internal port scan, and discovered there was an SAP system behind that. And then he configured SAP WE to connect through the subrouter to the SAP system, right? So he's already in the kind of accessing the SAP system that's in the internal network. So this is how we can detect that kind of activity with the subrouter logs.
Yeah, depending on the ACL, he's accessing a dispatcher in the backend, but he could be accessing any other service like an SSH or terminal server, any other service depending on how misconfigured the ACL is. So as you can see, there are traces in the log file of the subrouter being generated, but we can point out this connect to. This is the connection attempt which is accepted, but if the ACL is properly configured, then he would get a permission denied, and in the log files it would be registered as this.
What we're showing here are how the subrouter registered this, so you can go after the log files and try to see if something is going wrong over there.
Well, some other examples, like when you try to retrieve information from the subrouter, it is also logged. Info requests denied are also logged. And very important are native connections. When you can use the subrouter, if it's not properly configured to access any service in the backend, it is very important as well. It is marked as native routing. So what we did is basically we tried to connect to different services in the backend, and there's a specific pattern that we can detect in the log file, which is permission denied for some services in the backend, and the services could be random or sequentially, but you will see a lot of permission denied and some accepted.
Yeah, and basically, I mean, obviously, then you have the game with the attacker, that the attacker could be doing this very slow, and obviously as any port scan, this could go under the radar. But if the attacker is not smart enough, you can see the date, right? You can see that in the very same second, there is someone, I mean, trying to connect to all different kind of ports from the same source IP, right? So that's very easy to spot as this is not a human behind that. That's something really automated going behind and trying to reach out to possible ports. So we got him. See, if he's trying to access through the subrouter, the detective may be able to get him.
Okay, again, summary, the subrouter log, it is not enabled by default. You have to configure the file name, and there are some other limitations, but there is a feature to do that. So if you are using the subrouter, you should have this enabled. Okay, so the next thing that the attacker is going to try is he has access to the SAP system. So he will try to brute force, for example, the login. So he
Substar is like the root for SAP systems, if you never heard it before. And believe it or not, I think every time we have done an assessment, we find it's a default user that comes with the SAP system, a standard user that is shipped with default password, right? So a default password, sorry. So that will be probably the first thing he will try if he gets to our SAP system.
So if he's lucky enough, he will get a user account, maybe not in the productive client, but in one of the default clients. So if he is able to do that, he has access to the SAP GUI and to execute transactions according to the privileges, which actually right now are full privileges.
We lost Jay. Access, he will probably create a backdoor user for him to be able to access later on with highest privileges, right? So he's creating the user, he will assign him SAP all privileges, that's the highest privileges that a user can have. So then he can perform any kind of business activity over the system. Well, that was it. We cannot create a user. No. Yeah. Well, as you see, SAP has some input validation, right? Yeah, so. Let's see if it works now. Okay, that was just a warning to tell you that you're. Yeah, in a real, this is a demo system, a real system, all that is already set up, so the attacker doesn't have to go through that hassle.
He creates a user. So the user is created, and now what the attacker is going to want to do is to assign support to this user.
So that's it. Then he has the backdoor user to access later on at his convenience if someone changes the default password or anything. So how the detective can see that from happening, right?
Okay, so there are several features provided by SAP to discover this kind of attacks.
Can you hear it still in the back? Because the microphone is not.
Okay, so the first one is the security audit log. This is like the security audit feature from SAP. Okay, so you can register a lot of different events regarding security, which are login attempts through RFC, through the DIAB protocol. You can register user creation, changes to authorizations. There are a lot of changes, including the audit config. And then you have a very detailed record, like this one, where you can see the user, you can see the terminal, date, time, and a lot of information regarding specific information of the event. Okay? So this is configured through SM19 and accessible through SM20. But what you should recall here is that the fact that it is not enabled by default. Okay? So if you want to be sure, if you want to register information regarding attacks, you definitely should have these kind of features enabled. Some other thing that is quite important is the fact that it has a limit that is configured, so you can change it. By default it's 20 megabytes, and it's one file per day. So if there are enough events generated, the security audit log stops logging till the end of the day. Okay, so if the log file is full, it is stopped logging, and then you don't have any other record generated through the day.
So the attacker could be doing like filling the log, right, and then doing the actual nasty things. But that's a limitation.
Then, in order to discover user creations or profile changes, all kind of user authorization activities, you have the user authorization change documents, which is a feature that is enabled by default in the SAP system, and it's quite useful because you have all the information regarding changes to profile, to roles, to authorizations, user creations, changes to the users. So as you can see the profiles added, deleted, user changes, user created. So that's also useful information in that sense. And it's stored in tables, in database. So you have there the reference. It's enabled by default, which is great. So you always have this kind of information. And then another also very interesting and important feature is the table change logging, which is the ability from SAP to register changes to transparent tables. So if you have transparent tables, you can configure these tables to be logged if the
Yeah, so basically if there is any kind of the attacker modifying business tables like I know credit cards or changing vendor bank accounts or things like that directly, if the table change login is enabled, that is not by default again. So there's this one is not by default. You would be able to log these changes in the tables and see the old value and the new value of every record that was modified.
So it's stored in database as well. So you have a big table with all the changes to the tables which are logged. You can access through SCU3. And okay, let's see one last feature before the next demo, which is the change documents. So we have seen security audit log, we have seen change documents for user authorizations, which is enabled by default. We have seen table change logging, which is not enabled by default, but you can configure, you can enable this and choose the tables, choose also the clients, which you can log, and start registering changes to these tables. And then you have change documents. Change documents is oriented to record changes to logical objects. Okay, so let's say that you want to register changes to a purchase order or any other business information. This can be configured with change documents, and any change to these objects, specific fields in these objects will be registered and stored in database as well. So this is very useful if you need to audit some business function or some business information. You can enable this, and you will be registering all the business information in the database as well. So these are the two tables which are being filled, CD for change document header and post, and you can access also with a report the information that is generated.
Now we're going to see what the attacker did, like trying to brute force the password and creating the user, how that is reflected on the SAP system, right? How we can do a forensic analysis on that and try to detect that kind of activities.
So let's say that we discover through the SAP router and through the SAP gateway that there is someone trying to access the systems, and let's see if he was able to do something. So
that's the analysis of the security audit log.
This is the security audit log. These are the logs generated for the security audit log. So you can see it is enabled, fully enabled for every user and every client. So we are registering everything. So we can see a successful login, which is, I guess it's mine. And we can see here trooper users created, authorizations for trooper users changed. So these are the records that were generated when the attacker created the user in the system. And we can also see the failed login attempt. I just tested.
So that's a very also that's okay. That's a very convenient or interesting pattern, right? You have a logon failed or maybe a few logon fails and a log successful right after it, right? So it's in order to correlate that could be a good pattern to detect that kind of malicious
And then
activity.
the creation of a user, of course. Yeah. So this is one way to discover the user creation. But if we include the USR02, for example, in the table change logging, we can also see that. So we can see that the trooper user was created. So this is another feature, another logging mechanism which is enabled. But you also have a report to see the user change documents, user authorization change documents. And let's see if there is a record there.
Yeah, the profile.
Okay, yeah, it's here. So We used 3 different ways to detect this user creation. Depending on which ones you have enabled, you can have different traces and information.
Yes, and some provide, I mean, as you saw before in the security audit log, that only said that the user authorizations were changed. But here, with the changed documents for user authorizations, you can see actually that this user was assigned with SAP all privileges, right? So that's obviously useful, detailed information that we need to retrieve.
And you don't have here, for example, the terminal, the source terminal, exactly. or the source IP address from which the attacker connected to create the user.
Yeah, so you have to kind of use them all and correlate them to get the full picture. So let's see now, so we got him again, right? We were able to spot some of his activities. So let's say now that the attacker wants to do something, he got access to a system, he created the backdoor user account. Now he's doing he's trying to do a business fraud, right? So he's trying to detour payments, for instance. So payments or this kind of systems are many times integrated with SAP systems through what is called the SAP Gateway. And these basically are interfaces to other systems like a SWIFT interface. So the attacker goes to the SM59 transaction and he starts reviewing all the connections that this system has. And suddenly he sees that there is a SWIFT payments interface, and that, well, this is going very technical, so we cannot get so much in detail, but basically he will see in that interface what's called the TP name or the program ID of that, let's say, to make it easy, of that interface, right? So actually what we talked in 2007 in Black Hat was mostly attacks against this kind of infrastructure that is by default unprotected. So now we'll see what the attacker would be doing to exploit that. So we're going to show this with some charts, some animations. So basically you have, this would be how the SAP system is working today. So it has an external RFC server with that program ID or TP name registered to the SAP Gateway. And every time there is a payment, that's going over that regular, obviously the Swift, the legitimate Swift interface. But what the attacker can do is block the connection to that interface. We call this evil twin, this attack evil twin, because he can basically register himself. There is no authentication to do that. He can register himself using the same ID as the original interface. So how the SAP Gateway works, when there is a new request, that will be sent to him, right? So he will be getting that information, and he may also be able to do, for instance, a man in the middle. So he would just modify just the target bank account, and he will get the money to him. So how can we spot that? How can we detect that in the SAP system logs? So this is, if we enable the SAP Gateway log, we may see something like this. We will see some previous records, and then we see basically the legitimate RFC server, this interface being registered to the gateway, but then we see another connection, another server with the same name, but coming from a different host, and that's like a random IP address that we don't know, right? So this could be a good way for us. This could be actually one of the few ways we have to detect these activities, because if you check the log files on the SAP system itself, on the transaction log files, you will see that the payment went to the right interface. These other technical attacks can only be registered if we are checking the gateway log. Unfortunately, by default, the gateway log is not enabled again. So, well, but we got him again, right? We've been able to get the attacker once more time. So what do we use the gateway logging for? Not only to detect these attacks, but all the attacks we have been talking about on 2007 and some in other presentations about RFC connections. And you have seen the kind of information that you can get from there. So, yes, as I mentioned before, this is not enabled by default, so you should enable that. And there are some settings that you also need to define if you want the file to rotate, if you want the file, a new file to be created every day, or how do you want to restrict that. But we definitely encourage you to enable the gateway log, right? do it with kind of care, because depending on the filters that you define, this could really be growing very fast if you have a busy SAP system, let's say, with many interfaces. So let's try to draw some conclusions from this. Unfortunately, yeah, we cannot cover, we realized when preparing this that we cannot ever cover this in a 1 hour talk. So we had to leave several login mechanisms out of the talk. What do you like?
Yeah, actually, there are several other deeply technical records generated by SAP. You have the system log, you have the system traces, you have the developer traces for each service, you have the SQL audit. So there are several other logs being generated that could be useful. But we're left out of the presentation because we're not so focused on getting traces of this type of attacks, but yeah, these are also valid.
And yeah, and again, most of them, for users to know, they're not enabled by default. And also what we didn't cover was attacks or logs in the Java stacks. So Java system, they have all different logging mechanisms that is important also for you to pay attention to.
Can you provide a list or something?
Yeah, sure. We in the updated slides we will include a list of those. Actually, we will include the because we actually had this for every method. So we include a summary of all the actually kind of logs that you can get from them. Yeah, that's a great idea. So when you get the slides on the website, in Troopers website, you will see all the mechanisms. So as we saw, there are several features provided by SAP that can help us to detect these suspicious activities and support forensic analysis. Something that I sometimes I really don't I know how to say it. I don't agree with is like when people say that logs are only useful if you review them. Right? Many people say, no, I won't enable the security of the log because no one is going to be reviewing it anyway. I think that still is useful to have the log files because it's a way where you can go back to if there is something, if you eventually detected that there was something going wrong, right? So I would still log anyway because they can serve for forensics purpose at the end. You may not be detecting the attack in real time, but at least you can go and have some information to check for. The problem with most of these features is that they are not enabled by default, and yeah, most of the customers we work with, they don't have them enabled. So it's very important for you to understand the limitations and characteristics of each of these methods. That's why we include these summaries of each one, so that you can have that as a reference and like a centralized, because otherwise going through all the SAP documentation can be a bit troublesome. So I think it's a good reference for you to keep, but also important for you to analyze the performance impact of enable them. And finally, yeah, I think that I kind of said it before, but if it's already difficult to see if our SAP system has been hacked or compromised, if we are not recording, if we are not enabling what SAP is providing us to help us with this task, then it's really impossible. So we will never realize, like what we showed before about the Turing, the payments, that's something you will never be able to get if you're not having the right log files in place. So it's something for us to think about and maybe test if we can enable this log so we can analyze even things in real time. So with that, I think we are good with time. Yeah, we have about 7 minutes. So any questions that you may have? Yes.
Is the support for centralized login?
Yeah, that's so the question is if it supports centralized login. Most of the mechanisms do not. So you cannot have a centralized. So it doesn't like export to syslog or something like that. And it's a great question as well. Like the security of the log, for instance, that's saved in a synchronous way. So if you enable that, every time the user is doing something, he has to wait in the backend for the log to be written. So that's why it may affect the performance. Yeah.
Concerning the logs, can I reduce the amount of log files being generated by pre-filtering what's to be logged into the data?
Actually, that would be a good feature or description for us to add. There, in certain logs you can, like the gateway log, you can do it. In the security of the log, you can define which kind of events you want to log.
The developer traces as well.
Developer trace as well.
can set a
But there are
filter.
others that are like black or white. But yeah, I think most of them have some filtering, like the web dispatcher. Well, the subrouter you don't, but the web dispatcher you do have. You can define what kind of information you log. If you want to log the contents of the request or not, and things like that.
Do you know by heart about the RC gateway?
What's that, sorry?
The gateway, do you know by heart? If you can
Yeah,
just go by, denial.
yeah, it's very, the gateway in particular is very flexible in that sense. You have like, I think like maybe 6 or 7 modifiers, like, okay, I want to log every connection and I want just to log external connections, or I want to log RFC calls. So it's very granular, the gateway.
Are the logs somewhat say tamper protected, or how easy is it to delete entries?
It's very easy, I would say. Yeah, unfortunately, there is no kind of integrity checks on the logs provided from SAP itself.
Yeah, but the thing is that some of these logs are stored in database, many others are saved in the file system. So if you have CDIDM, you can modify anything, but you can create your own user. You are like God in the SAP system.
Yes.
So
CDIM is basically what we talked before about the OS and the database layers. So an attacker actually, if he goes through those layers, that will never be registered on an SAP log, right? So if he creates a user directly in the database, there is no SAP log that will be detecting that. So, and even, I mean, he can go directly to the database and modify and delete the contents from the log tables, right? Yeah.
so if he has that level of privileges, it's pretty much it.
Yes?
Do you know which CM systems support SAP?
Which, sorry?
CM. Security.
Sorry, yeah. Yeah. They are, I think ArcSight has some connectors. Nitro has some connectors, and there are some companies that are working on creating like connectors, but we see very few systems, very few SAP systems connected to CM engines today. Yeah. Any other? Okay, anyway, feel free to contact us over Twitter or email or whatever. We're going to be obviously around today and tomorrow, so we can, of course, address any further questions that you may have. Yeah, so thank you very much.
Thank you.